close your eyes. Imagine a city standing at the edge of two worlds. To the west, the familiar lands of Europe. To the east, the ancient kingdoms of Asia. Between them, a narrow strip of water so perfectly placed that whoever controls it controls the conversation between continents. This city has been called many names across the centuries. Byzantium, Constantinople, the God-guarded city, the Queen of Cities. Today we call it Istanbul, but for over 1,000 years, the people who lived inside its walls called it something simpler. They called it Rome. This is not a story about an empire that rose and fell. This is a story about an empire that refused, for 11 centuries, to accept that it was supposed to fall, an empire that was left for dead dozens of times and kept standing back up, an empire whose final breath exhaled on a May morning in 1453, carried inside it the seeds of everything we now call the modern world. Settle in. Let the night grow quiet around you. We are going back to the beginning. Chapter 1. Rome does not fall. It moves east. There is a date that every student of history learns early. 476 AD. The fall of Rome. They are told. The end of the ancient world. The moment the lights went out. It is a clean, satisfying date. It fits neatly on a timeline. It gives teachers something to underline. It is also, in the most important sense, deeply misleading. On the 4th of September in 476, when a Germanic general named Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, the man who received those symbols of power did not believe he was receiving the inheritance of a dead civilization. He believed he was the Roman emperor. He had always believed that. So had the millions of people living inside his borders, speaking his laws, using his roads, praying in his churches, and measuring their lives against the rhythms of an empire that had been the organizing fact of the Mediterranean world for 5 centuries. The Eastern Roman Empire, which historians would eventually call the Byzantine Empire, a name its own citizens never used and would not have recognized, did not experience 476 as a catastrophe. It experienced it as a Tuesday. To understand why, you have to go back further. You have to go back to a man standing at the edge of a small peninsula above cold grey water, and the decision he made there that would shape the next 1100 years of human history. That man was Constantine. Constantine I became the sole ruler of the Roman Empire in 324 AD. After more than a decade of civil wars that had torn the carefully constructed system of shared rule apart at every seam, he was a military man, a pragmatist, and increasingly something harder to define, a man who believed, with a conviction that had been hardening since a vision before the Battle of Milvian Bridge 12 years earlier, that he was governing under divine protection, that the Christian God had chosen him, that his empire and the Christian church were meant to grow together into something the world had never seen. He needed a capital worthy of that vision. Rome itself presented problems. It was magnificent. Certainly, no city could match its monuments or its history. But Rome was also landlocked, difficult to supply and defend, and saturated with the political culture of old aristocratic families who were not going to quietly reorganize themselves around a new order simply because the emperor wished it. Constantine needed a fresh start. He looked east. The site he chose had been a modest Greek colonial city for nearly 1,000 years. Byzantium, founded according to tradition around 657 BC, sat on a triangular peninsula where the Bosphorus Strait narrowed between Europe and Asia. From a military and commercial standpoint, it was one of the most advantageously positioned pieces of land in the known world. Consider the geography for a moment, because it explains everything that follows. The peninsula was protected on 2 sides by water. To the south, the Sea of Marmara. To the northeast, a long curved harbour called the Golden Horn, deep enough for large ships and sheltered enough to anchor a fleet through any weather the Black Sea could produce. The only land approach was from the west, a single front where walls could be built and held. Every ship travelling between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean had to pass through the Bosphorus. The city that sat at that choke point could tax everything, see everything, stop anything. In the ancient world, this was not merely an advantage. It was a kind of geographic superpower. Construction of the new city began in 324 AD and moved at a pace that required tens of thousands of workers and the stripping of artistic treasures from cities across the empire. Later tradition records that Constantine walked the boundaries of the city personally, spear in hand, pacing out where the walls would rise, moving further than his advisors expected until they finally asked when he intended to stop. He told them, according to accounts written generations later, that he was following a guide only he could see. Whether that story reflects literal truth or later embellishment, we cannot say with certainty. What is not in doubt is the scale of his ambition. The city was formally dedicated on the 11th of May in 330 AD. Constantine called it Nova Roma, New Rome. Within a generation, everyone was calling it Constantinople, the city of Constantine. The old Rome did not simply vanish. It remained the symbolic heart of the Western Empire, the city of tradition and history. But the center of gravity had shifted. The money, the administration, the imperial court, and all the networks of power that radiated from it. All of this migrated east with the speed of water finding its natural level. When Constantine died in 337 AD, the empire he left was already, in the ways that mattered most, an Eastern empire. The West was getting harder to hold. The reasons had been accumulating for over a century. The Western provinces were more rural, less commercially developed, harder to tax, and therefore harder to defend. The Rhine and Danube frontiers were under continuous pressure. The currency had been debased repeatedly. Trade networks that had once made the Mediterranean a unified economic space were fragmenting. The East had none of these problems to the same degree. The eastern provinces, particularly Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor, were among the most urbanized and commercially active territories in the world. They generated tax revenue that the West could not match. Their cities had been sophisticated trading centers for centuries before Rome arrived. They did not need Rome to teach them how to run an urban economy. This disparity deepened with every passing decade. When the Emperor Theodosius I died in 395 AD and divided the empire between his two sons, the 17-year-old Arcadius receiving the east and the 10-year-old Honorius the west, the practical consequences became impossible to ignore. The West entered a period of accelerating fragmentation. The East held. Why did the East hold when the West did not? Historians have debated this question for centuries, and the honest answer involves many reinforcing factors rather than a single cause. Constantinople's location was part of it. Its harbour was protected by chains that could be stretched across the Golden Horn to block enemy ships. Its landward approach was narrow enough to be defended by walls. As long as the Eastern Empire controlled the sea lanes and could supply the city by water, it could not be starved into surrender. The commerce was another factor. The Silk Road's western terminus was in Constantinople. Spices, silk, grain, timber, luxury goods from across the known world all flowed through the Bosphorus, and the empire taxed every ship that passed. This created a revenue base that the West simply could not replicate. And then there was the administrative inheritance. The eastern provinces had been governed, before Rome arrived, by sophisticated Hellenistic kingdoms with centuries of experience managing complex urban economies. When Rome absorbed them, it adopted their administrative machinery. The result was a governmental apparatus considerably more developed and resilient than anything the Latin West had built. When the western provinces fell away, to Germanic kingdoms in the 5th century, the Eastern Empire watched, sometimes intervened, occasionally grieved, and fundamentally did not collapse. It adjusted. It traded diplomatically where it could not fight militarily. It maintained its core, and it continued to call itself, without irony or embarrassment, the Roman Empire, because it was. The textbooks that mark 476 as the fall of Rome are describing a real event in the West, but they are also, inadvertently, erasing 1100 more years of Roman history from the story. The people of Constantinople called themselves Romans. They called their emperor the Roman Emperor. They called their laws Roman law. They called their civilization Roman civilization. They were not wrong. They carried forward the Roman legal tradition, the Roman administrative structures, the Roman conception of a universal civilized order held together by law and centered on a single imperial city. They modified it, adapted it, blended it with Greek philosophy and Christian theology and the cultural inheritance of the ancient Near East. But they never stopped calling it Rome. That continuity is what makes the Byzantine story so extraordinary and so frequently misunderstood. This was not the replacement of Rome by something new. This was Rome, persisting, Rome bending under pressure, Rome losing territories and populations and military reach, and occasionally losing its mind entirely under emperors who should never have been allowed near power, but Rome continuing nonetheless, with the lights on and the walls up and the ships moving through the Bosphorus on a Tuesday morning as if the Western Empire had never existed at all for 11 more centuries. Through plagues and sieges and theological controversies and the rise of Islam and the chaos of the Crusades and the slow, grinding pressure of enemies on every frontier, the Eastern Empire endured. It did not endure quietly. It did not endure without cost, but it endured, and the story of how it did, what it built, and what it ultimately left behind when the walls finally fell on a May morning, 11 centuries after Constantine first put spear to earth, is one of the longest and most extraordinary stories in all of human history. That story starts here, with a man, and a city that did not yet exist, and everything that came after. Chapter 2. The God-guarded city. Walk up to it on a quiet morning, before the city fully wakes. Touch the brick. Lay your palm flat against it and feel the roughness of mortar that was mixed 16 centuries ago by workers who believed they were protecting the center of the civilized world. In some sections the towers lean. In some sections the facing has crumbled away entirely, exposing the rubble core inside. But the basic structure, the bones of it, is still there. Red brick and limestone, rising from the earth on the western edge of a peninsula, stretching from the sea in the south to the harbour in the north. The Theodosian walls. Few structures built in the ancient world have had a more direct influence on the survival of the civilization we inherited, not through fame or beauty or artistic achievement, though they have a severe beauty of their own, but through sheer, patient, functional endurance, through being exactly what they were supposed to be, for exactly as long as they were needed. Built between 412 and 422 AD, during the reign of Theodosius II, he was a child when construction began. He would live to see those walls tested by Attila the Hun, and die knowing they had held. They would keep holding for over 1,000 years. To understand what these walls meant to the people inside them, you have to understand what Constantinople meant to Byzantine civilization. This was not merely a capital city. It was a sacred city, The Byzantines had developed, over generations, a theological understanding of empire that wove together Christian faith and Roman identity into something almost impossible to separate. The emperor was understood as the representative of God on earth, the protector of the Christian world, the living link between divine order and human civilization, and Constantinople was where that link was anchored. The most important relics of the Christian faith had been gathered inside the city's churches and palaces. When enemies appeared on the western horizon, the patriarch would lead processions along the battlements carrying sacred icons, asking for divine intercession. When the walls held, and for century after century they did hold, the victory felt like more than military success. It felt like confirmation. Now, consider the walls themselves, because they deserve to be understood as the engineering achievement they were. The Theodosian system was not a single wall. It was a layered defensive complex of extraordinary sophistication. The outermost line was a broad moat, approximately 20 meters wide, that could be flooded when attackers approached. Behind the moat rose a low outer parapet. Behind that stood the outer wall, roughly 8 to 9 meters high, studded with towers at regular intervals. And behind that, separated by a broad terrace, rose the great inner wall. The inner wall was the heart of the system, nearly 5 meters thick, 12 to 15 meters high, 96 towers, each rising several meters above the wall walk between them, spaced close enough that archers in adjacent towers could cover every inch of ground below. No army attacking from the land, using the siege technology available before gunpowder, could reliably breach this system. You could not mine under it effectively. You could not starve the city because it could be supplied by sea. You could not break through by direct assault because breaching one line only exposed your exhausted troops to fire from the next. The walls were repaired constantly, maintained across centuries with the same care the Byzantines gave to their churches and their law codes. They were not a relic. They were a living institution. The city they protected was, for most of the Byzantine period, the largest and wealthiest in the Christian world. At its height, Constantinople may have held several 100,000 people, a concentration of urban population that Western Europe would not approach again for centuries. Its markets sold goods from every corner of the known world. Its workshops produced silk and luxury goods, valued from England to China. The Hippodrome, adjacent to the Imperial Palace, held perhaps 100,000 spectators for the chariot races that were the empire's defining public spectacle. The factions that organized these races, the Blues and the Greens, were not merely sports clubs. They were political organizations, neighborhood associations, informal mechanisms of civic identity that connected ordinary people to the larger life of the empire in ways that formal institutions could not. Around the Hippodrome spread the forums, the churches, the markets, the hospitals, the great cisterns carved into the bedrock beneath the streets that stored enough fresh water to sustain the population through years of siege. And above all of this, visible from almost every point in the city, the dome of the Hagia Sophia rising over the skyline. When foreign visitors arrived in Constantinople for the first time, their accounts almost universally describe something close to bewilderment. The primary chronicle of the Rus people, compiled in the 12th century, but drawing on earlier traditions, records that ambassadors sent by the Prince Vladimir of Kiev in 987 AD attended a service in the Hagia Sophia. Their report home described not knowing whether they were in heaven or on earth, that they could not forget the beauty they had seen. How much weight to place on this particular account, written a century or more after the events it describes? Historians have long debated. What is clear is that Vladimir chose Eastern Orthodox Christianity for his people, and that the power Byzantine civilization projected through its sacred spaces and its liturgical tradition played a significant role in shaping that world-changing decision. But Constantinople was also a city of explosive volatility. The same density of population that made it magnificent made it dangerous. Riots in the Hippodrome could become uprisings that swept from one end of the peninsula to the other in hours. Factions that had been rivals for generations would unite against an emperor they collectively decided had gone too far. The imperial palace was connected to the Hippodrome by a private corridor. Emperors used it to arrive at races without passing through the streets. The symbolic proximity of palace and arena was not accidental. Power and performance were inseparable in Byzantine political culture. The crowd in the Hippodrome was not merely an audience. It was, in a very real sense, a mirror in which the emperor saw his own legitimacy reflected or denied. The first great external test of Constantinople's resilience came from the north, from the rolling plains beyond the Danube, where Attila the Hun arrived in the 440s AD as the dominant figure of the steppe world, launching devastating raids across the Balkans and demanding tribute. He received it. He demanded more. He received that too. The Eastern Empire's response to Attila was not heroic by any conventional standard. It was expensive. It was at times humiliating. It was effective. Constantinople never fell to Attila. The walls held. The sea lanes held. When Attila died in 453, and his empire immediately fragmented, the East was still standing, still functioning, still Roman. That ability to absorb pressure, redirect threats, spend money when fighting was not advantageous, and maintain the core while the periphery burned, was among the most important strategic skills the Byzantine Empire ever developed. It was not glamorous. It did not produce the kind of military glory that fills epic poems, but it worked across a timescale that military glory alone could never have sustained. The walls held. The ships kept sailing. The markets kept trading. The dome of the Hagia Sophia kept catching the morning light. The god-guarded city endured. As it would, and would, and would, again, and the story of how it kept enduring, through forces that should have ended it a dozen times over, is the story we are just beginning to tell. Chapter 3. Justinian and the Last Dream of Rome. He was born a peasant. That single fact explains almost everything about him. Flavius Petrus Sabatius Justinianus came into the world around 482 AD in a small village in what is now North Macedonia. His family were farmers, Latin-speaking, in a world growing increasingly Greek. Obscure in a court that valued ancestry above almost everything else, his uncle changed everything. Justin, a capable soldier from the same rural background, had worked his way through the ranks of the Byzantine army over decades of loyal service. He was not an intellectual. He was not particularly sophisticated, but he was tough, reliable, and present at the right moments. In 518 AD, when the Emperor Anastasius died without a clear successor and palace factions scrambled to fill the vacuum, Justin emerged from the confusion wearing the purple. He was approximately 68 years old. He had no children. He brought his nephew to Constantinople. The young man Justin, educated and eventually designated as heir, was everything his uncle was not. Justinian read voraciously. He engaged with theology, law, architecture, and military theory with equal seriousness. He worked long hours with an energy that astonished his contemporaries, reportedly needing very little sleep, moving through the palace at odd hours, reviewing documents, receiving petitioners, discussing policy with advisors. His enemies called him the emperor who never sleeps. They did not mean it as a compliment. When Justin died in 527 AD, Justinian became emperor at approximately 45 years of age. He would reign for 38 years. But before we follow what he did with those years, we need to meet the woman beside him. Because to understand Justinian fully is to understand that at the most critical moment of his reign, he was the man Theodora allowed him to be. Theodora was the daughter of a bear keeper employed at the Constantinople hippodrome. She had grown up inside the machinery of that great institution, watching the factions, absorbing the street-level politics of the greatest city in the world from childhood. She had worked as an actress, a profession that carried in Byzantine society a stigma so severe that Roman law prohibited senators from marrying women of the stage. She was also, by every account that survives, formidably intelligent, not court intelligent, not the kind of intelligence that reads the room and says the right thing at dinner, the kind of intelligence that sees clearly what other people are pretending not to see, and says it out loud anyway. Justinian had the law changed. He married her. He made her empress. The court was scandalized. The aristocratic families, who had been navigating imperial politics for generations, found themselves dealing with a woman who had grown up a few hundred meters away in the shadow of the hippodrome, and who understood power at a level that made their own calculations look slow. They never forgave her. History has been considerably more generous. The test came faster than anyone expected. In 532 AD, 18 months into Justinian's reign, Constantinople erupted. It began in the hippodrome, as so many Byzantine crises did. The blues and the greens had been at each other's throats for years. On the 13th of January, during a day of races, the chanting in the stands shifted from factional rivalry into something new and far more dangerous. The two factions began chanting together. The word was Nika, victory. The racing cry transformed into a rallying call for revolt. By nightfall, the city was burning. What followed lasted 5 days. The original Hagia Sophia burned. The palace was threatened. Members of the aristocratic opposition moved to acclaim a new emperor. For a few hours, it looked genuinely possible that the revolt would succeed. Justinian's inner circle gathered to plan evacuation. Ships were ready in the harbour. The men around the emperor were debating not whether to leave, but how quickly. Theodora sat in the throne room and said nothing. Then she spoke. Her words were recorded by the court historian Procopius, who was present. Though it is worth noting that Procopius was not always a neutral observer of events in Justinian's court. As he records it, she said she would not flee, that the imperial purple was the finest burial shroud, that a person who had tasted power could not endure exile, that she, for her part, had no intention of surviving as anything other than what she was, whether those were her exact words or Procopius shaping the moment into something more dramatic. The outcome was real. The men in the room stopped talking about ships. Justinian stayed. His generals went into the city, into the hippodrome where the rebels had gathered. The revolt ended in violence. Ancient sources give casualty figures that modern historians treat with appropriate caution, as ancient casualty numbers regularly reflect rhetorical emphasis as much as actual counting. But the scale of the suppression was real, and its purpose was deliberate. The revolt was over. Justinian emerged from the Nika crisis with something he had not fully possessed before it: a tested partnership, an understanding, proven under the most extreme conditions, of exactly what he and Theodora could rely on each other for, and a determination to build something that the revolt had nearly destroyed. He began with the city itself. Within weeks, construction began on a new Hagia Sophia. The ambition was staggering. Tradition records that Justinian told his architects, Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, to build the greatest church in the world. They were not engineers in the conventional sense. They were mathematicians. theorists, men who had spent their careers thinking about geometry and the behavior of structures under load. What they produced remains one of the great achievements of human construction. The dome they designed was approximately 31 meters in diameter, rising 55 meters above the floor. At its base, 40 windows were cut into the drum below it, filling the interior with light that seemed to have no single source. The effect, which you can still experience in Istanbul today, is of a space that defies its own physical dimensions. The dome appears to float. The light appears to come from the air itself. Justinian dedicated the church on the 27th of December in 537 AD. Later tradition preserves the story that he walked through the great doors, stood in silence beneath the dome, and then spoke words comparing himself to Solomon and his temple. Whether those exact words were his, or were attributed to him afterward by writers who understood the magnitude of what had been built, we cannot know with certainty. What we can know is that the sentiment they carry is accurate. Nothing built in the Christian world before it compared, and nothing built in the Christian world for the next 1,000 years would compare either. But Justinian's greatest achievement was not a building. It was a book. The Roman legal tradition had accumulated across 1,000 years into a body of material so vast, so contradictory in places, and so difficult to navigate that even trained lawyers could not reliably determine what the law actually said on any given question. Justinian recognized this as a problem at the foundation of Roman governance. If the law could not be known, it could not be applied consistently. If it could not be applied consistently, it was not really law at all. He assembled a team of the finest legal minds in the empire, led by a scholar named Tribonian, and gave them a task of extraordinary ambition: organize, rationalize, and codify the entire body of Roman law into a coherent and comprehensive system. Tribonian and his team worked for 3 years. What they produced is called the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. Its influence on subsequent history has been substantial and direct. Where universities across medieval Europe developed systematic legal education, the text they taught from was Justinian's compilation, the civil law tradition that governs most of continental Europe, Latin America, and large parts of the wider world today traces its intellectual foundations, through many centuries of development and adaptation, back to the work that Tribonian's team assembled in 6th century Constantinople. Then there were the wars. Justinian had not forgotten that the western provinces had passed out of Roman control in the previous century. He had not accepted it. He had a general capable of attempting their recovery. Belisarius was perhaps the finest military commander of the 6th century. Patient, innovative, personally brave. Justinian sent him first to North Africa in 533 AD, with a force that ancient sources put at around 15,000 soldiers. The Vandal kingdom that had controlled the region for a century was defeated in 2 engagements. Belisarius returned to Constantinople within a year. Then Justinian sent him to Italy. The reconquest of Italy was supposed to replicate the African campaign. It did not. The Ostrogoths, who controlled the peninsula, fought with a tenacity that the Vandals had not shown. The war ground on for years, then decades. Rome itself changed hands multiple times. Its population was reduced by siege, famine, and la mal, and plague to a fraction of what it had been. The great aqueducts were cut. The Senate ceased to function. By the time the war ended in 554 AD, Italy was nominally Roman again, but it was a broken shadow of the province Justinian had dreamed of restoring. The reconquest had cost more than it recovered. And even as the Italian war consumed men and money, something was spreading from Egypt that would cost far more than any military campaign. In 541 AD, plague arrived in Constantinople. Modern epidemiologists believe it was bubonic plague, the same bacterium that would devastate Europe in the 14th century as the Black Death. The grain ships that brought Egypt's harvests to Constantinople's warehouses brought the rats and their passengers with them. The city, dense with people and dependent on that grain trade, was uniquely vulnerable. Procopius, who witnessed it, describes the city falling into a kind of stunned paralysis. The dead accumulated faster than they could be buried. The emperor himself contracted the disease and survived. But the disruption to administration, army, and economy undid years of careful work. The plague recurred in waves for the next 2 centuries. Justinian died in 565 AD at approximately 83 years of age. He had built the Hagia Sophia. He had produced the Corpus Juris Civilis. He had reconquered North Africa and Italy and parts of Spain. He had governed, with Theodora beside him, until her death in 548, with an energy and ambition that no emperor before or after quite matched. He had also exhausted the treasury, left the army depleted. The reconquered Western territories did not hold. Within 3 years of his death, the Lombards invaded Italy and took most of it. The dream of a reunited Roman Empire died with him. But the Hagia Sophia still stood. The dome still caught the morning light. The law code still shaped the legal inheritance of civilizations that did not yet exist. He reached for everything. He did not get everything. But what he built, in stone and in law, lasted. And in the long story of Byzantine civilization, that is not a small thing. Chapter 4. Fire, Plague, and the Prophet's Shadow. The world that Justinian had known ended not with a single catastrophe, but with a slow convergence of forces that no one inside Constantinople could have fully predicted or prepared for. It arrived the way weather arrives. First, a change in the light, then a shift in the air. Then, before you have fully understood what is happening, everything around you looks different from how it looked before. 3 forces converged on the Byzantine world in the decades after Justinian's death in 565 AD. The first was military exhaustion. The second was biological catastrophe. The third was something entirely new, born in the deserts of Arabia, that would redraw the map of the known world more dramatically than anything since Alexander the Great. Consider first what the empire looked like when Justinian died. Large but fragile. The reconquests in the West had been bought at enormous cost. The treasury was spent. The army was depleted. The provinces were taxed to their limit. And on the eastern frontier, the Sassanid Persian Empire was pressing again. The Sassanids were not barbarians. They were a sophisticated civilization with their own imperial traditions, their own religion in Zoroastrianism, their own art and administrative systems. They had been the great rival of Rome and Byzantium for generations. Looking across the contested frontier in Syria and Mesopotamia, not at an overwhelming power to be avoided, but at a competitor to be matched. The wars between Byzantium and Persia in the late 6th and early 7th centuries were among the most destructive the region had seen in centuries. Cities changed hands. Populations were displaced. The tax base eroded with every campaign season. In 614 AD, the Persians captured Jerusalem. From the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, they took what Byzantine Christians believed to be the true cross, the relic that Constantine's mother Helena had reportedly discovered nearly 3 centuries earlier. It was carried off to the Persian capital. The psychological impact on the Byzantine world went beyond military defeat to a civilization that understood itself in specifically religious terms. It felt like something more profound than the loss of a province. The emperor Heraclius responded with one of the more remarkable military recoveries in the history of the late ancient world. He reorganized the shattered army. secured Constantinople behind its walls, stripped the churches of their treasures to fund his campaigns, and launched a series of offensives deep into Persian territory that reversed the entire course of the war. In 628 AD, the Persians agreed to peace. The true cross was returned. The lost provinces came back. Heraclius returned to Constantinople in triumph. He had perhaps 5 years to enjoy the victory, because while Byzantium and Persia had been exhausting each other across the Syrian and Mesopotamian frontier, something had been happening in the Arabian Peninsula that neither empire had the information or the attention to properly understand. The Arabian Peninsula in the early 7th century was, from the perspective of Constantinople, essentially a periphery. Its tribes were known. Some served as auxiliary soldiers. The caravan routes crossing it were commercially important. But the interior desert, the tribal confederacies moving across its vast spaces, was not a place that either great empire considered a serious source of power. They were catastrophically wrong. In 610 AD, a merchant from the city of Mecca named Muhammad began receiving what he understood to be divine revelation over the next 22 years, until his death in 632 AD. Those revelations accumulated into the foundational text of a new religion. Islam was not merely a new theology. It was a complete system for organizing human society, providing law, governance, social relationships, and military obligation within a single comprehensive framework. What made it politically powerful was the unity it created among people who had not been united before. The Arab tribes had spent generations in internal conflict. Their martial skills were real and well developed. What they had lacked was a common cause large enough to redirect those skills outward. The new faith provided that cause. The armies that carried it were motivated by a conviction that functioned in battle after battle as a force multiplier that numbers alone cannot account for. When Muhammad died in 632 AD, his successors found themselves leading a force of extraordinary energy, pointed at two empires that had just spent a generation destroying each other. In 636 AD, at the Battle of Yarmouk, in what is now the border region between Syria and Jordan, a Byzantine army met the Arab forces and was decisively defeated. Syria fell within a year. Palestine followed. Egypt fell in 642 AD. This last loss was the one that changed everything. Egypt had long been among the most productive provinces in the empire. Its grain fed Constantinople. Its commercial networks connected the Byzantine world to the trade routes of the Indian Ocean. Generations of Roman and Byzantine fiscal policy had been built around the assumption that Egypt's revenues would always be there. When Egypt passed to the Arab Caliphate, the fiscal foundations of the Eastern Empire shifted dramatically. Ancient sources and modern historians alike recognize the loss as one of the most consequential single events in Byzantine economic history, though the precise accounting of its effects remains a matter of scholarly discussion. What is clear is that the empire that emerged from the Arab conquests of the 630s and 40s was fundamentally smaller and fundamentally poorer than the one that had existed before. It was also, in a strange way, more coherent. The provinces the Arab armies swept through were home to Christian communities that had been in theological dispute with Constantinople for generations. For many of these communities, Arab rule was not obviously worse than what had come before. The bitterness that might have mobilized entire populations to fight to the last was not present to the degree the empire's strategists had assumed. The empire contracted. What remained was smaller, but more internally unified, predominantly Greek-speaking, predominantly committed to the theological tradition of Constantinople. It was still Rome. Heraclius lived to see everything he had recovered disappear again. He died in 641 AD. reportedly bedridden in his final months. Watching reports arrive from the eastern provinces, the man who had carried the true cross back in triumph watched as the lands he had recovered passed out of Roman hands. The military response to this new reality was practical and durable. The Emperor Constans II reorganized what remained of the empire's provincial administration into a new structure called the theme system. Military commanders, called strategoi, governed territories, called themes, with both civil and military authority. Soldiers were granted land in exchange for military service, creating a self-sustaining provincial defense that did not depend entirely on the central treasury. It was a practical answer to an impossible fiscal problem. The empire adjusted. The walls still stood. The ships still moved. And then, the Arab armies came for the city itself. They came by sea in 674 AD, establishing a base on the Asian shore of the Bosphorus and launching attacks for 4 consecutive years. Here, in the crisis that should by any military logic have ended the empire, something unexpected happened. The Byzantine navy deployed a weapon that the Arab fleet had no answer for: Greek fire, an incendiary compound whose precise formula has never been definitively reconstructed by modern chemists, projected through bronze tubes mounted on Byzantine warships. It burned on water. It could not be extinguished with water. It clung to ships and men and consumed them. The Arab fleet was destroyed. The siege was lifted in 678 AD. The subsequent peace required the Arab Caliphate to pay annual tribute to Constantinople. The empire that everyone expected to be the next to fall had not only survived, it had extracted payment from the most powerful state in the world. The city was smaller. The treasury was thinner. The frontiers were contested. But Constantinople stood, still Roman. And the next chapter of that story begins not with another army at the gates, but with a question that tore the empire apart from within. A question about paint and wood, and what it means to reach toward God through an image made by human hands. Chapter 5. The Sieges that defined a civilization. There is a particular kind of courage that history rarely celebrates. Not the courage of the single hero, not the charge across open ground, or the last stand at the bridge. The courage of men standing at walls for days, then weeks, then months, knowing that the force outside is larger than anything they can match, knowing that the help they were promised has not arrived, and standing anyway, because the walls are there to be stood at, and the alternative is unthinkable. That kind of courage was tested twice at Constantinople, with consequences whose effects can still be traced through the subsequent history of the world. The first test came in 674 AD, the second in 717 AD. Many historians of the medieval world would rank them among the most consequential defensive actions of the era. To understand why, you have to understand the state of the Arab Caliphate in the decades following its initial conquests. The armies that had taken Syria, Palestine, and Egypt were not a temporary phenomenon. They were the military expression of a civilization in full expansion, energized by religious conviction, backed by the economic resources of territories that now included some of the wealthiest land in the world. The Caliphate had destroyed the Sassanid Persian Empire entirely. To the west it had taken Egypt and was pressing through North Africa toward the Atlantic. To the north, it faced Byzantium. Constantinople was the prize that would complete the picture. The city that controlled the Bosphorus controlled the trade routes between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, and the Prophet Muhammad himself, according to traditions preserved in Islamic scholarship, had spoken of Constantinople's eventual conquest as a future glory of the faith. The military logic and the religious significance pointed in the same direction. Take Constantinople, and the remaining fragments of Byzantine power would wither without their center. Leave it standing, and it remained a base from which Byzantium could project power and potentially recover what it had lost. The first serious attempt came after years of preparation. Arab forces established a naval base at Cyzicus on the Asian shore of the Sea of Marmara in 674 AD. For 4 years, they launched annual campaigns against the city, probing the walls and harbour defences, looking for the weakness that would let them in. They found Greek fire instead. Byzantine sources attribute the development of this weapon to a Syrian architect named Callinicus, who came up to Constantinople around 673 AD. Modern historians and chemists have proposed various reconstructions of what the substance may have been, involving petroleum derivatives and other materials available in the ancient world. But no reconstruction has been universally accepted. What all sources agree on is the effect, projected through bronze siphons mounted on Byzantine warships. It ignited on contact and continued burning in circumstances where ordinary fire would be extinguished. It burned on water. It clung to whatever it touched. It consumed ships from the outside in while the crew was still aboard. The psychological effect on an enemy encountering it for the first time was as important as the physical destruction. These were experienced soldiers. They had faced cavalry and infantry and siege engines across the breadth of the known world. They had not faced anything like this, something that violated the basic rules of how fire behaved, something that could not be put out. The Arab fleet withdrew in 678 AD. The Caliph agreed to pay annual tribute to Constantinople. The empire that had been losing provinces for a generation had extracted payment from the most powerful state in the world. The second and larger attempt came in 717 AD. The Caliph Suleiman assembled a force that Arab and Byzantine sources alike describe as substantial, reflecting a major commitment of caliphate resources. The exact size of both the land army and the fleet is reported differently across ancient sources, as ancient numerical accounts regularly are, and modern historians approach such figures with appropriate caution. What is clear from multiple accounts is that this was among the largest military operations the Caliphate had yet attempted. The emperor who faced this assault was Leo III, who had come to power earlier that same year. He was a soldier emperor, brought to power by the military frontier, inheriting a government that was financially precarious and facing an existential threat within months of his accession. He responded with a combination of defensive preparation, naval deployment, and diplomatic outreach that the situation required. The Arab land army arrived at the Theodosian walls and found what every army that had approached those walls had found. The fortifications were as formidable as their reputation. The garrison was prepared. The city had been provisioned for a long siege. The Arab fleet entered the waters around the city and encountered Greek fire again. Byzantine accounts describe significant destruction of the Arab naval forces. The blockade intended to cut the city's sea supply lines never fully materialized. Then the winter arrived. The winter of 717 to 718 AD was, by contemporary accounts, exceptionally severe. The Arab army, camped outside the Theodosian walls, had not prepared for a northern winter of that intensity. Men and horses began dying of exposure and disease at a rate that no siege could sustain indefinitely. Leo also deployed diplomacy. The Bulgars, who controlled territory to the north and west of Constantinople, were persuaded or paid to raid Arab supply lines from behind. The pressure from an unexpected direction added to the mounting difficulties of the besieging force. By spring, the Arab commander ordered withdrawal. The army that retreated from Constantinople in 718 AD was a fraction of the force that had arrived. Arab sources acknowledged the severity of the losses. The second great siege had failed. Now consider what was at stake. If Constantinople had fallen in the early 8th century, the empire that had served as a buffer between the Islamic world and the European interior would have been gone. The specific chain of transmission by which Greek and Roman learning survived into the medieval period would have been broken or fundamentally altered. The Eastern Orthodox Christianity that shaped the religious and cultural identity of Russia, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece might have developed very differently, or might not have spread through those cultures in the forms we recognize. This is not to say that Islamic civilization was a threat to human progress. The Islamic Golden Age that followed produced extraordinary achievements in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. But the particular character of European civilization, the specific blend of Roman, Greek, and Christian traditions that produced the medieval world and the modern one, depended significantly on the survival of Byzantium as a living tradition through these centuries. That survival was not inevitable. It was won by men standing at walls, by a navy deploying a weapon no one could put out, by a winter that arrived when it was needed, and by a city that refused, for 11 centuries, to accept that it was supposed to fall. Leo III, having organized the defense, he spent the rest of his reign attempting to understand why God had granted Byzantium this extraordinary survival and what the empire needed to do differently to remain worthy of it. His answer would set off the most destructive internal controversy in Byzantine history. But that is the next chapter's story. For, now, hold the image of those walls in the grey morning light, the army on the western horizon, the garrison at their stations, the winter settling over everything with a cold that no one had expected, and the city, patient and intact, still standing as the sun came up. Chapter 6. Emperors, Monks, and Holy Images. There was a monk named Stephen. He was old when they came for him, old enough that the authorities might have hoped he would simply comply, or simply die, before they had to deal with him. He lived in a monastery on the Black Sea coast, during a period when the Byzantine Empire had turned against the very images that filled its churches. He was respected in his community, sought out for counsel, known for a quiet consistency that was, in its way, more threatening to power than open defiance. He refused to renounce his veneration of sacred images. They dragged him through the streets of Constantinople. They beat him, and on a day in 764 AD, a mob that the Emperor Constantine V had done nothing to prevent killed him in the street. He became a martyr. He became a saint, and his story, told in monastery after monastery across the empire, became one of the central human narratives of the most damaging internal controversy Byzantine civilization ever produced. It was called Iconoclasm, from the Greek words for image and breaking, the breaking of images. To understand why it mattered so completely, why men and women were willing to die on both sides, you have to understand what images meant in Byzantine religious life. Walk into any Byzantine church and you are surrounded by them. On the walls, on the ceiling, on the great carved screen that separates the nave from the altar, on portable panels carried in processions, kept in homes, touched by the hands of the faithful in moments of prayer and crisis and grief. Faces of Christ, faces of the Virgin, faces of the saints who had suffered for the faith across the centuries. These images were called icons, and in Byzantine Christianity, they were not merely decorations. They were understood, through a theology that had developed over centuries, as genuine points of contact between the human and the divine. The icon was not God. It was not the saint, but it participated in the holiness of what it depicted, in a way that made it more than paint on wood. When a Byzantine Christian kissed an icon, they were directing their veneration through the image toward the divine reality it represented. The distinction was carefully maintained in Orthodox theological thinking. Their opponents saw idolatry. Leo III, the emperor who had organized the successful defense against the Arab siege, he had spent the years after that victory asking a question that genuinely troubled him. Why had the Arab armies, who rejected image veneration entirely, been so militarily successful? Why had the Byzantine Empire, whose churches overflowed with icons, suffered such catastrophic losses in the previous century? His answer was theological. God had withdrawn his protection, Leo believed, because the empire had fallen into a form of idolatry. The veneration of icons was not theologically distinguishable from the worship of idols the Old Testament condemned. In 730 AD, Leo ordered the removal of a prominent icon of Christ that hung above the main gate of the imperial palace. The soldiers he sent to remove it were attacked by a crowd who tried to stop them. The soldiers completed their work. The earthquake that followed lasted, with interruptions, for over a century. Leo's iconoclasm was not only a religious position, it carried a political dimension that historians have long recognized. The monasteries of the Byzantine Empire had accumulated, over generations of pious donations, enormous wealth in land and gold. They housed hundreds of thousands of monks whose labor was removed from the tax base. Their abbots wielded spiritual authority that sometimes competed directly with imperial authority. The religious and political motivations were impossible to fully separate. Leo's son, Constantine V, who ruled from 741 to 775 AD, pursued iconoclasm with considerably greater force. He was capable, in many respects, winning significant military victories and reorganizing the provincial administration with genuine skill, but his treatment of icon venerators crossed into territory that even sources writing from within the imperial tradition describe with visible unease. Monasteries were secularized. Monks were publicly humiliated. Relics were thrown into the sea. A patriarch who refused to support imperial religious policy was flogged and exiled, and men like Stephen were killed in the street. Constantine was not acting from simple cruelty. He wrote theological treatises defending his position. He engaged seriously with opposing arguments. He believed, with intellectual conviction, that icon veneration was a corruption of true Christianity that had to be removed. He was, by the judgment of history, wrong. The strongest theological defense of icon veneration came from an unexpected quarter. John of Damascus, a Christian scholar living under Arab rule in territory beyond the Byzantine emperor's reach, wrote systematic defenses of icons that drew on the deepest traditions of Greek Christian thought. His central argument cut to the heart of the matter. If God had truly become human in the person of Jesus Christ, if the divine had genuinely entered the material world and taken on a physical body, then the material world was capable of bearing the divine presence. Images were not an offense against God. They were a consequence of the incarnation. To reject them was, in a certain theological sense, to pull back from the full meaning of Christ becoming flesh. This argument would eventually win, but it took time and real suffering. The empire's relationship with Rome added another dimension to the crisis. The Pope had no intention of accepting Byzantine imperial authority over church practice. The iconoclast emperors' attempts to enforce their policy in Italy, where papal authority was strong, created fractures in the relationship between Constantinople and Rome that would prove permanent. Seeds planted in the soil of the iconoclast controversy would grow, over centuries, into the Great Schism of 1054 AD. The first period of iconoclasm ended in 787 AD through circumstances that were themselves a piece of Byzantine political drama. The Emperor Leo IV died in 780 AD, leaving the throne to his 10-year-old son, Constantine VI, with his widow Irene serving as regent. Irene was a devout iconophile who had spent years carefully concealing the depth of her convictions from her iconoclast husband. Now, with power in her hands, she moved. She convened the Second Council of Nicaea in 787 AD. Bishops from across the empire and representatives from Rome gathered to formally settle the question. The council ruled in favor of icon veneration, the theological distinction between veneration directed through an image toward the divine reality it depicted and worship offered to the image itself was carefully articulated and officially endorsed. Iconoclasm was condemned as heresy. The relief across the iconophile communities was real. Monks returned from exile. Monasteries were restored. Icons came back to the walls. But the story did not end there. A second period of iconoclasm began in 815 AD. Under Leo V, another soldier emperor who drew from military defeats the same theological conclusion his predecessor had drawn a century earlier. This second phase lasted until 843 AD, when the Empress, Theodora, acting as regent for her young son, Michael III, restored icon veneration for the final time. The date of that restoration, the first Sunday of Lent in 843 AD, is still observed every year in the Eastern Orthodox Church as the triumph of orthodoxy. In Orthodox churches around the world, on that Sunday, icons are carried in procession and the condemnation of iconoclasm is formally renewed. A controversy that tore the Byzantine world apart for over a century ended not with a military victory, but with a ceremony. With images returned to the walls, with an old argument finally resolved. Think of Stephen for a moment. Old man dragged through the streets of Constantinople, beaten and killed for refusing to say that the faces on the walls of his church were something other than what they had always been to him. He did not live to see the triumph of orthodoxy, but what he died defending was, in the end, what survived. What emerged from the iconoclast controversy was a Byzantium that had fought a war with itself and come through it. A civilization whose religious identity had been tested to its foundations and had not broken, whose monks and theologians had demonstrated that they could resist imperial power when imperial power demanded something that violated the deepest convictions of the faith. The empire had found its way through, scarred, but holding, and in the century that followed the triumph of orthodoxy, with the internal wound beginning to heal, the empire would enter a period of military recovery and cultural brilliance that stands as one of the most remarkable chapters in Byzantine history. That chapter begins with a murder. Chapter 7. The Macedonian Golden Age. Power in Byzantium rarely arrived cleanly. It arrived through marriages and coups and carefully managed appointments and, occasionally, through the kind of direct violence that everyone understood had happened and no one was supposed to discuss directly afterward. The empire had a remarkable ability to absorb the ugliness of how someone had come to the throne, set it aside, and evaluate the ruler by what they did once they got there. Basil I tested this capacity considerably. He came from a peasant family in the Macedonian countryside, worked his way to Constantinople as a young man, and through a combination of physical impressiveness, practical intelligence, and a gift for attaching himself to the right people at the right moments, rose to become the companion and eventual co-emperor of Michael III. Michael III was not a serious man. He raced chariots with an enthusiasm the court found embarrassing. He drank heavily. He allowed the real business of government to be handled first by his uncle Bardas, who was capable, and then by Basil, who was more so. In 866 AD, Basil arranged the murder of Bardas. The following year, he arranged the murder of Michael himself. He then ruled for 19 years as one of the most effective emperors of the period. The Byzantine political tradition, shaped by centuries of exactly this kind of succession, absorbed the manner of his arrival, and moved on. What mattered was what came next. And what came next, under Basil and the dynasty he founded, was extraordinary. From 867 AD to 1056 AD, nearly 2 centuries, the Macedonian dynasty governed an empire experiencing one of the great periods of Byzantine vitality. Military expansion recovered territories lost since the Arab conquests. Art and scholarship flourished. Missionary work permanently shaped the religious identity of the Slavic world. And at the dynasty's peak, under the emperor, the sources call Basil II, the empire reached a territorial extent and internal coherence it had not achieved since Justinian. But let us not get ahead of ourselves. Basil I reorganized the legal system, updated Justinian's code, and began the military recovery that his successors would complete. His son, Leo VI, called the Wise, earned his epithet through an enormous body of legislative and administrative writing that shaped Byzantine governance for generations. His reign was not militarily glorious, but institutionally productive, in ways that mattered for the longer arc of the dynasty's achievement. The real military renaissance came under the emperors of the mid-10th century. Nikephoros Phokas, who ruled from 963 to 969 AD, recovered Byzantine territory in Cilicia and Syria that had been in Arab hands for 3 centuries. He retook the island of Crete in 961, ending Arab piracy in the Aegean that had disrupted Byzantine commerce for generations. Contemporary sources describe him as physically imposing, personally austere, and entirely without the social graces that Byzantine court culture valued. He wore a hair shirt under his imperial robes. He slept on the floor. He was murdered in 969 AD by his nephew John Tzimiskis, who had become the lover of the Empress Theophano and conspired with her to remove the husband she found intolerable. John Tzimiskis continued the military campaigns with equal skill and less austerity. He pushed deep into Syria, reaching the outskirts of Jerusalem before deciding that the strategic cost of holding that far south was prohibitive. He died in 976 AD, possibly of typhoid, contracted during the Syrian campaigns. The empire then passed to 2 young co-emperors who had been nominal rulers since childhood. The elder was Basil II. He was 18. He had been a symbolic emperor for years, surrounded by regents who made the real decisions. His early years as an active ruler were genuinely difficult. He faced serious internal rebellions from the great military aristocratic families of Anatolia, men who had the resources to challenge imperial authority directly and very nearly succeeded. He survived through determination and through a decision that had consequences extending far beyond the Byzantine frontier. He turned to Vladimir of Kiev. Vladimir, the Rus prince. He was willing to provide military help in exchange for something no Byzantine emperor had previously offered a foreign ruler: the hand of a Byzantine princess. Anna, the sister of Basil II, a woman of the ancient Macedonian dynasty, was sent north to marry Vladimir. The condition was that Vladimir convert to Christianity. He did. He was baptized in 988 AD. He returned to Kiev, threw the idols of the old Slavic gods into the Dnieper River, and brought in Byzantine clergy to establish the church among the Rus, the Christianization of Russia, and through it the spread of Eastern Orthodox Christianity through much of the Slavic world, is historically connected to this moment. A political arrangement between a Byzantine emperor under pressure and a Rus prince, sealed with a marriage and a conversion, shaped the religious and cultural geography of half a continent for centuries. The soldiers Vladimir sent south helped Basil put down his internal rebellions. The emperor emerged from these crises with a harder, more methodical character than he had entered them with. He had seen what the great landowners would do when given the opportunity. He spent the rest of his reign systematically limiting their power and redistributing accumulated wealth back toward the small-holding farmers, whose decline had been weakening the empire's military and fiscal base for generations. His legislation against the great landowners was fierce and effective. The theme system depended on small-holding soldiers who owned enough land to equip themselves. When aristocratic families absorbed those small holdings into vast estates, they destroyed the human infrastructure of the frontier defense. Basil reversed that process with the kind of determined, systematic application of force that characterized everything he did. And then there were the Bulgars. The Bulgarian Empire to the north and west of Constantinople had been a recurring challenge for Byzantium since the 7th century. By Basil's time, it was ruled by Tsar Samuel, a capable ruler who had rebuilt Bulgarian power and presented a genuine military challenge to the empire's northern frontier. Basil fought the Bulgarians for most of his active reign. Year after year of difficult campaigning through mountainous terrain where Byzantine advantages in open ground meant little. Progress was slow and costly. In 1014 AD, at the Battle of Clydian, the Byzantine army caught a large Bulgarian force in a mountain pass and surrounded it. What followed has been debated by historians ever since. Basil had the captured Bulgarian soldiers blinded. Ancient sources give figures that modern historians treat with appropriate caution. But the scale clearly indicated a significant number. For every 100 prisoners, one man was reportedly left with one eye, so that he could lead the others home. The blinded soldiers made their way back to Tsar Samuel. Byzantine sources record that Samuel collapsed when he saw them, and died within days. Basil earned the name by which history remembers him. Basil Bulgaroktonos. Basil, the Bulgar slayer. The act troubled some Byzantine contemporaries. It was understood in the brutal calculus of medieval warfare as a deliberate demonstration of what continued resistance would cost. Whether it achieved its intended effect or simply hardened hatred, the historical record does not settle. What is clear is that Bulgarian military resistance eventually collapsed, and by 1018 AD, Basil had incorporated Bulgaria into the Byzantine state. The cultural life of the Macedonian period matched the military achievement. Byzantine art reached a level of refinement unmatched in the Christian world. Icons produced in this period show a mastery of gold work and manuscript illumination that still commands respect today. Byzantine silks were luxury goods of international significance. The manuscript tradition preserved and transmitted classical Greek learning with scholarly rigor that would prove invaluable when those texts eventually reached Western European scholars. Byzantine missionaries carried the Orthodox faith and the Greek alphabet, adapted for Slavic languages, northward into territories that had no previous written tradition. Cyril and Methodius, the Byzantine scholars who created what became the Cyrillic alphabet, gave the Slavic world the tools of literacy and connected those newly literate cultures permanently to the Byzantine inheritance. The alphabet you see on Russian street signs today, the liturgical language of the Russian Orthodox Church, the architectural forms of the great Russian cathedrals, all of these trace back to relationships and decisions formed during the Macedonian Golden Age. Basil II died in 1025 AD without having married or produced an heir. The empire he left was large and coherent. It was also, in ways that would become clear within a generation, built to a significant degree on his personal authority. The great landowners he had suppressed resumed accumulating power when his restraining hand was removed. The military system he had maintained through personal attention began to be neglected by successors who preferred cheaper alternatives. The Macedonian dynasty ended in 1056 AD with the death of Theodora, the last surviving member of the line, an elderly woman brought out of monastic retirement to rule as empress when the male line failed. She died without naming a successor. The Golden Age was over, and on the eastern frontier, in the passes of Armenia and the upland plains of Anatolia, a new force was building, patient, mobile, and directed by a sultan who had heard, correctly, that the army standing between him and the heart of the empire was not the army it had been. The Seljuk Turks were coming, and this time, the wall that mattered was not in Constantinople. It was in Anatolia, and it was about to break. Chapter 8. The Crack in the Walls. There are defeats that change everything, not the ordinary defeats that empires absorb and recover from. The lost battles and abandoned provinces and strategic retreats that are simply the cost of maintaining power across centuries of continuous pressure. Those happen to every empire, and the capable ones learn to live with them, adjust their expectations, redraw their maps, and continue. This was different. On the 19th of August, in 1071 AD, at a place called Manzikert near the eastern shore of Lake Van, in what is now eastern Turkey, the Byzantine army met a Seljuk Turkish force under the Sultan Alp Arslan and suffered a defeat so complete, so structurally damaging, and so psychologically devastating that the empire never fully recovered from it, not in the way it had recovered from Yarmouk, not in the way it had absorbed the Arab sieges and emerged stronger. Manzikert opened a door into the heartland of the empire, and what came through that door over the following decade unfolded with a relentless logic that contemporaries watched with something approaching disbelief. To understand why, you have to understand what Anatolia meant to Byzantium. Anatolia, the great peninsula that forms the Asian core of what is now Turkey, was not simply a province. It was the foundation, the land that fed Constantinople, the reservoir of military manpower from which the theme armies had drawn their soldiers for 4 centuries, the source of the tax revenues that paid for everything else. Without Anatolia, there was no Byzantine Empire in any meaningful strategic sense. There was only a city on a peninsula, surrounded by water, with no hinterland to sustain it. The Seljuk Turks had been pressing against the eastern frontier since the 1040s. They were a Turkic people from the Central Asian steppe who had converted to Sunni Islam and risen rapidly to dominate the former territories of the Arab Caliphate, which by the mid-11th century had fragmented into competing regional powers. The Seljuks unified much of the Islamic world under their military leadership. Taking Baghdad in 1055 AD and assuming the role of protectors of the Sunni Caliphate, their raids into Byzantine Anatolia were initially the kind of large-scale pressure that frontier powers had always conducted. But as Byzantine internal politics deteriorated after the end of the Macedonian dynasty, as the great military families and the civilian court aristocracy fought each other for control of the government with an intensity that repeatedly produced short-lived or incompetent emperors, the frontier defences that Basil II had maintained through personal attention and continuous military presence began to erode. The emperor who led Byzantium into Manzikert was Romanos IV Diogenes. He was a competent general who had come to the throne in 1068 AD through marriage to the widowed empress Eudokia, and who understood clearly that the eastern frontier required urgent attention. He launched 3 campaigns into the east in an effort to stabilize the situation before it became unmanageable. The 3rd campaign ended at Manzikert. The details of what went wrong are disputed in Byzantine sources and have been debated by historians ever since. What is clear is that the battle was decided not primarily by Seljuk military superiority, but by a catastrophic failure within the Byzantine army itself. Andronikos Doukas, commanding a significant portion of the Byzantine rear guard, withdrew from the battlefield at a critical moment. Whether this was deliberate political betrayal, designed to destroy Romanos and advance the interests of the Doukas family who were his rivals, or a catastrophic misreading of the tactical situation. Byzantine sources disagree, and the question remains historically unsettled. The result was the same. The rear guard that should have supported the main advance was not there when it was needed. The Byzantine army, cut off and encircled by mobile Seljuk cavalry, disintegrated. Romanos himself was captured. He was brought before Alp Arslan. What happened next was, by the account of Byzantine and Islamic sources alike, remarkable. The Sultan did not execute his imperial prisoner. He released him, after negotiating a ransom and a peace treaty, and allowed him to return to Constantinople. It made no difference. The political enemies who had worked against Romanos had already moved to depose him in his absence. When he returned to Byzantine territory, he found himself in the middle of a civil war. He had no resources to win. He was captured and blinded with such brutality that he died of his wounds within months. The throne passed to Michael, the seventh Ducas. The peace treaty Romanos had negotiated died with him. What followed over the next decade was exactly what the Seljuks needed. Byzantine armies that should have been defending Anatolia were instead fighting each other across the breadth of the peninsula. Rival claimants hired Seljuk mercenaries to fight their Byzantine opponents, bringing Turkish forces deep into Anatolian territory and familiarizing Seljuk commanders with the geography, the road networks, and the defensible positions of a land they were beginning to occupy. Within a decade of Manzikert, much of Anatolia was gradually, region by region, passing into Seljuk hands, not through a single campaign or a decisive battle, through the slow infiltration of a frontier that no longer had an army to defend it, through the settlement of Turkish nomadic groups in the upland pastures that had previously sustained Byzantine smallholding communities, through the abandonment of towns and villages by populations that fled west toward the coastal regions where Byzantine authority still functioned. The theme system that had been the military foundation of Byzantine power for 4 centuries collapsed across Anatolia in less than a decade. The revenues from the Anatolian themes disappeared from the imperial treasury. The manpower base that had always allowed Byzantium to rebuild its armies after defeats contracted dramatically. The new emperor who faced this catastrophe, Alexios I Komnenos, came to the throne in 1081 AD through a military coup that was itself a symptom of how completely the post-Manzikert crisis had destabilized the state. He was 24 years old, physically tough, intellectually acute, politically ruthless in the way that Byzantine survival had always required, and confronted with a situation that would have broken a less determined man before he properly understood it. He spent his reign rebuilding from almost nothing. The army he inherited was a shadow. He melted down church treasures to fund military operations and dealt with the theological consequences later. He reorganized the administrative structure around his own family, creating a network of personal loyalties in place of the institutional structures that had collapsed. He fought the Normans, pressing into Byzantine territory in the Balkans from their base in southern Italy. He fought the Pechenegs, who threatened from the north. He negotiated constantly with the Seljuks, trading territory for stability when he could not fight. And in 1095 AD, he made a decision that he believed was the only remaining option available to him. He wrote to Pope Urban II in Rome and asked for help. He was specific about what he needed: mercenary soldiers from Western Europe to augment his rebuilt Byzantine forces and help recover the Anatolian frontier. He was not asking for a religious crusade. He was asking for military contractors. What he got was something else entirely. Urban II preached the First Crusade at Clermont, in France, in 1095 AD. He called for the liberation of Jerusalem, the recovery of the Holy Land, the defense of Eastern Christians, and the unification of Christendom in a great common enterprise. The response across Western Europe was extraordinary in its scale and intensity. What began arriving at Constantinople in 1096 was not the organized force of professional soldiers Alexios had imagined. It was something simultaneously more powerful and more dangerous than anything he had planned for. The armies of the First Crusade were enormous, poorly coordinated, led by Western European nobles who had their own ambitions and who did not consider themselves under Byzantine command or subject to Byzantine strategic direction. Alexios maneuvered with considerable skill. He extracted oaths from the Crusade leaders that territories recovered from the Turks would be returned to Byzantine sovereignty. He provided guides, supplies, and naval support. He worked with the Crusaders when he could, and around them when he could not. The First Crusade succeeded. Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders in 1099 AD. Alexios recovered some Anatolian territory in the wake of the Crusade's passage. The immediate military crisis stabilized somewhat, but the relationship between Byzantium and the Western crusading movement was damaged from the beginning by a fundamental incomprehension that ran in both directions. The Western Crusaders saw Byzantium as theologically suspect and not quite a reliable ally. The Byzantines saw the Crusaders as violent, undisciplined, and as likely to threaten Byzantine interests as to serve them. Both assessments contained enough truth to be dangerous. The Komnenos dynasty that Alexios established, continued by his son John II and his grandson Manuel I, governed for a century with genuine skill and produced a partial military and cultural recovery. John II was a commander of real ability who recovered significant territory and died, in a piece of dark irony, from a wound caused by his own poisoned arrow during a hunting accident in 1143 AD. Manuel I was the last of the great Komnenian emperors, a man of enormous energy who engaged with the Western world more fully than any of his predecessors. His military ambitions eventually outran his resources. A disastrous defeat at the Battle of Myriokephalon in 1176 AD, where a Byzantine army was ambushed by the Seljuks in a mountain pass, shattered his plans for recovering the Anatolian interior. He died in 1180 AD, leaving a depleted treasury and a political situation that deteriorated rapidly in the hands of his successors. The crack that had opened at Manzikert a century earlier had never been properly closed. It was about to become something much worse. Chapter 9. Brothers in Christ. Enemies, indeed. On the 12th of April, in 1204 AD, the armies of the Fourth Crusade breached the walls of Constantinople. Not the Theodosian walls, those great fortifications that had stood against every assault for 8 centuries. The walls facing the Golden Horn on the city's northern side, where a Venetian fleet had maneuvered with skill and audacity to put soldiers on the battlements. The city that had never fallen to Arab or Bulgar or Rus fell instead to the armies of Western Christendom, to men who wore the cross on their tunics, to soldiers who had taken vows to fight for the liberation of the Holy Land and who were fighting their way through the streets of the greatest Christian city in the world. To understand how this happened, you have to go back further than 1204. You have to understand a relationship that had been deteriorating for over a century, through accumulated misunderstandings, genuine theological disagreements, commercial rivalries, and a series of events that pushed what might have remained a difficult partnership into something more irreparably broken. The formal breach between the Catholic Church in Rome and the Orthodox Church in Constantinople occurred in 1054 AD. The date is given in textbooks as the Great Schism, as if a single moment produced a complete rupture. The reality was more gradual and more painful. The theological differences had been accumulating since the early centuries of Christianity. The most technically contentious was a dispute about a single Latin word added to the Nicene Creed by the Western Church without Eastern consent. The creed, as agreed at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, described the Holy Spirit as proceeding from the Father. The Western Church added the phrase, "and from the Son," the filioque clause, asserting a dual origin. To Western theologians, this was a clarification already implicit in Christian scripture. To Eastern theologians, it was a unilateral alteration of a text that could only be changed by an ecumenical council. And beyond the procedural problem, a theological error that misrepresented the inner life of the Trinity. One word, two traditions, centuries of accumulated tension finding a focal point. The disagreement represented something larger than theology. The Western Church increasingly understood the Pope as the supreme authority whose decisions were binding on the entire Church. The Eastern Church understood theological authority as residing in the consensus of ecumenical councils, with the Patriarch of Constantinople holding a primacy of honor rather than a primacy of jurisdiction. In July of 1054 AD, Cardinal Humbert placed a bull of excommunication against the Patriarch of Constantinople on the altar of the Hagia Sophia. The Patriarch responded by convening a council that excommunicated the papal legates in return. Neither side initially regarded this as permanent. Both expected the dispute to be resolved through negotiation and compromise. It was not resolved. It hardened, instead, through subsequent decades of estrangement and theological elaboration, into the permanent division between Catholicism and Orthodoxy that still exists today. The Crusades made it worse. The behavior of crusading armies passing through Byzantine territory created resentments that accumulated with each subsequent wave. Western soldiers, who expected to be resupplied by their fellow Christians, found Byzantine pragmatism, which sometimes included commercial arrangements with Muslim powers when Byzantine interests required it, deeply suspicious. Byzantine authorities, managing the passage of enormous armed forces through their territory, found Western arrogance and unpredictability infuriating. The massacre of the Latin community in Constantinople in 1182 AD was a moment of particular bitterness. During a political crisis following the death of Manuel I, anti-Latin sentiment that had been building for years exploded into violence. Latin merchants and their families were attacked. Men were killed. Women and children were enslaved. The papal legate was murdered. The news reached Western Europe and was not forgotten. The Norman king of Sicily launched a retaliatory attack on Byzantine territory almost immediately, sacking the major city of Thessaloniki in 1185 AD with a brutality that Byzantine sources describe in detail and with horror. The cycle of violence and retaliation was feeding on itself. The Fourth Crusade was proclaimed by Pope Innocent III in 1199 AD. The strategic plan involved a sea-borne assault on Egypt, correctly identified as the economic foundation of the power controlling the Holy Land. The crusade needed ships. Venice had ships. The agreement required the Crusaders to pay an enormous sum for transport. When the army assembled at Venice in 1202 AD, it was significantly smaller than projected. The payments were insufficient. The Crusaders were in debt to Venice before the expedition had gone anywhere. The Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, old and reportedly blind and possessed of a commercial intelligence sharpened by decades of Venetian politics, offered a solution. The Crusaders could work off part of their debt by capturing the city of Zara on the Adriatic coast. Zara was a Christian city under Hungarian rule. It was not a legitimate target for a crusade. The Pope explicitly forbade the attack. The Crusaders attacked anyway. They needed the ships. Then a Byzantine prince arrived at their camp with an offer. Alexios Angelos was the son of a deposed Byzantine emperor who had escaped to seek Western help in recovering his father's throne. Help him retake Constantinople, he told the crusade leaders. Restore his father, and he would pay off the Venetian debt. Provide military support for the Egyptian campaign. supply the crusade with food and soldiers, and bring the Orthodox Church into union with Rome under papal authority. It was an extraordinary offer. It was also one that Alexios had no realistic possibility of fulfilling. The debate within the crusade leadership was genuine and sometimes fierce. Many refused and made their own way to the Holy Land. Others, guided by the weight of debt and the practical necessity of the next step, agreed. The crusading fleet appeared before Constantinople in 1203 AD. The first attack failed. The walls held. The Venetian fleet found a less defended section of the harbour wall and briefly put soldiers on the battlements. But the Byzantines counterattacked and the Crusaders withdrew. Then the Byzantine Emperor fled the city. The blind old Emperor Isaac II was restored to the throne. His son was crowned co-emperor as Alexios IV. And then the promises could not be kept. The money did not exist in the treasury. The Byzantine Church and people had no intention of accepting Roman authority. The political situation in Constantinople destabilized rapidly as the Byzantine population, furious at the presence of the crusading army outside their walls, and furious at the emperor who had brought them there, turned against Alexios IV. In January of 1204 AD, a palace coup removed him. Both he and his father were subsequently murdered. The new emperor repudiated all promises and ordered the crusading army to leave. The crusade leaders met to consider their position. They were still in debt to Venice. The Egyptian campaign had not happened. The promises that had justified diverting the crusade to Constantinople had not been kept. They were camped outside the greatest city in the Christian world. With a fleet in the harbour and an army on the shore, they decided to take the city for themselves. The partition of the Byzantine Empire was agreed before the final assault. Venice would receive 3/8 of the city and the trade routes and islands that would give it commercial dominance of the eastern Mediterranean for generations. On the 12th of April, in 1204 AD, the assault began. This time, the harbour walls did not hold. The sack that followed lasted 3 days. The historian Nikitas Honiats was present in the city. His chronicle is the most detailed surviving Byzantine account of what happened, and it is not easy reading. He describes walking through streets littered with bodies, past burning buildings, past the remains of artworks destroyed simply because they were too heavy to carry. He describes horses brought into the Hagia Sophia. He describes a grief that went beyond political catastrophe into something that felt, to him and to the people around him, like the end of a world. He was not wrong about the feeling. Whether it was the end of a world is something historians have debated ever since. The city survived. The tradition survived. But the confidence that had sustained Byzantine civilization through 11 centuries of pressure, the bone-deep conviction that God would not allow the city to fall, that the walls would hold because they had always held, that was something that did not fully come back. The bronze horses that had stood in the hippodrome since Constantine's day were taken to Venice. They stand above the portal of St. Mark's Basilica today. You can see them if you visit Venice, looking out over the lagoon, looking west, where they were carried. A Flemish nobleman named Baldwin became the first emperor of the Latin Empire, established on the ruins of Byzantine political authority. The Orthodox Patriarch was replaced by a Latin one. The Latin Empire lasted 57 years. The Byzantine court went into exile at Nicaea in western Anatolia, where the Lascarid dynasty continued to call itself the Roman Empire in exile and maintained Byzantine administrative and cultural traditions through the decades of occupation. The Lascarid emperors governed their reduced territories with genuine skill and maintained the diplomatic and military pressure on the Latin Empire that eventually created the conditions for its collapse. In 1261 AD, a Byzantine general named Alexios Strategopoulos discovered that the Latin garrison of Constantinople had temporarily left the city with most of its forces to conduct a raid elsewhere. He had a small force, far too small by any conventional military calculation, to assault the greatest fortified city in the world. He went in anyway, through a gate left inadequately guarded. In the middle of the night, Constantinople was recovered so swiftly that the Latin Emperor, Baldwin II, barely had time to flee by ship before Byzantine soldiers were in the streets. Michael VIII Palaiologos entered Constantinople in triumph. He walked to the Hagia Sophia. He restored the Orthodox Patriarch. Constantinople was Roman again. But the empire that had recovered it was not the empire that had lost it. 57 years of Latin occupation had stripped the city of treasures accumulated across 9 centuries. The population had declined dramatically. The economic networks that had made Constantinople the commercial center of the Eastern Mediterranean had been reorganized around Venetian and Genoese interests, and did not simply revert when Byzantine authority was restored. The wound of 1204 never fully healed. The city that had defined Christian civilization for 9 centuries had been sacked by Christians. The sacred objects that had been the spiritual guarantee of Constantinople's protection had been stolen or destroyed by men wearing the cross. The theological estrangement between East and West, which might conceivably have been bridged by patient diplomacy and genuine goodwill on both sides, had been turned into something that felt, to the Byzantine survivors and their descendants, like a betrayal too deep for forgiveness. When the Ottomans came, 2 centuries later, with their enormous bronze cannons pointed at the Theodosian walls, the Byzantine Emperor would appeal to the West for help. Some help would come, not enough. The memory of 1204 would ensure that not enough was all the West was ever going to send. Chapter 10. Exile, Return, and the Long Twilight. There is a particular quality to the light in a city that knows it is dying. Not the dramatic darkness of sudden catastrophe. Not the sharp clarity of crisis that demands immediate response. Something quieter and more final than either of those. The light of a civilization that has understood. In some part of itself, it cannot quite bring to full consciousness, because full consciousness would be unbearable, that the story is moving toward its end. Constantinople, in the last 2 centuries of Byzantine existence, had that quality. It was still magnificent in many respects. The Hagia Sophia still dominated the skyline. The walls still stood. The Patriarch still processed through streets that had been Christian streets for 9 centuries. Scholars still gathered in the libraries. Artists still produced icons and manuscripts of extraordinary refinement. But the city Michael VIII had recovered in 1261 was not the city that had been lost in 1204. It was smaller, poorer, less populated, and surrounded by a strategic situation that had no good solutions. Only choices between bad and worse. Michael himself governed with genuine ability in circumstances that would have defeated a lesser man. His masterstroke against the ambitions of Charles of Anjou, the French prince who had established himself as King of Sicily and harboured explicit plans to retake Constantinople, was the Sicilian Vespers. In 1282 AD, on the evening of Easter Monday, tensions between the French garrison of Sicily and the local population erupted into violence. The French forces in Sicily were attacked simultaneously across the island by local rebels who had been, according to most historical accounts, cultivated and supported through Byzantine diplomatic and financial channels over the preceding years, though the full extent of Byzantine involvement remains a matter of historical discussion. Within hours, thousands of French soldiers were dead. Charles of Anjou's Sicilian base was gone. The threat to Constantinople evaporated overnight. Michael died later that year. He left an empire that was still standing, which, given what he had inherited, was a genuine achievement. His son, Andronikos II, inherited a state that was structurally sound in the ways Michael's diplomacy had made it sound, and fundamentally fragile in the ways no diplomacy could address. The most urgent of these was Anatolia. The Mongol disruption of the Seljuk state had temporarily reduced organized pressure from the east, but it had also created the conditions for numerous smaller Turkish principalities to emerge, each pressing in its own direction against the remnants of Byzantine Anatolian control. These principalities did not operate like the old Seljuk state, with a central government that could be negotiated with and bought off. They were decentralized, self-sustaining through raiding and conquest, motivated by a combination of religious conviction and the practical incentives that continuous warfare provided to their members. Andronikos made a decision that seemed financially rational and proved strategically catastrophic. He reduced much of what remained of the professional Byzantine army in Anatolia, replacing expensive theme soldiers with cheaper mercenary forces. The Catalan Company, several thousand mercenary soldiers from the Iberian Peninsula. There was hired in 1303 AD to defend the Anatolian frontier. They were effective fighters. They were also, as their behavior immediately demonstrated, impossible to control. When their commander, Roger de Flor, was killed by Byzantine officials who found him unmanageable, the company turned their considerable military skills against their employers. The Catalan Company spent years ravaging Thrace, the agricultural hinterland of Constantinople, with a thoroughness that left the region depopulated and economically broken. When they finally moved on to take control of the Duchy of Athens in Greece, they left behind burned villages and abandoned farms that Byzantium never fully recovered. The Anatolian frontier, meanwhile, collapsed without the professional army that had been disbanded to save money. Among the Turkish principalities expanding into the vacuum was one led by a man named Osman in 1300. Osman's domain was not obviously more significant than those of his neighboring rulers, but the Osmanli had a location and a momentum that would prove decisive. Their proximity to Constantinople meant Byzantine territory was always available. The religious prestige of fighting the frontier against the great Christian city attracted warriors from across the Turkish world. The civil wars that defined Byzantine politics in the middle decades of the 14th century accelerated the process. Both sides, in the conflict between John V Palaiologos and his regent, John Cantacuzene, hired Turkish mercenaries, including Ottoman forces, to fight their Byzantine opponents. The Ottomans, who crossed the Bosphorus to fight as Byzantine auxiliaries, looked at Thrace and understood what they were looking at. In 1354 AD, an earthquake destroyed the walls of the Byzantine city of Gallipoli on the European side of the Dardanelles. Ottoman forces crossed the straits and occupied the ruins before Byzantium could repair them. It was the first permanent Ottoman foothold in Europe. Adrianople, the major Byzantine city in Thrace, fell to the Ottomans in 1369 AD. It was renamed Edirne and became the Ottoman capital. The logic was unmistakable. The Ottomans were not simply raiding. They were building a state whose capital was now in Europe, looking toward Constantinople from the west as well as from the east. Constantinople, in the final century of its existence, was a city surrounded. Byzantine territory had contracted to the city itself, a small region of Thrace immediately surrounding it, and a few outposts in Greece and the Peloponnese. The population had declined to perhaps 50,000 from the hundreds of thousands of the imperial peak. Large sections within the Great Walls had been given over to orchards and vegetable gardens. The agricultural land necessary to sustain a population that could no longer be reliably supplied from an empire that had largely ceased to exist. The emperors of the last century spent their reigns in permanent crisis management. They travelled to Western Europe repeatedly, appealing in person to the Pope and to Western monarchs for military assistance. John V Palaiologos travelled to Rome in 1369 AD and personally converted to Catholicism, hoping that a visible gesture of religious union would unlock Western military support. It did not. He was detained in Venice on his return journey because he could not pay his debts. The most powerful Christian emperor in the East. Detained in Venice. For unpaid bills. The Union of Florence, in 1439 AD, formally declared the union of the Catholic and Orthodox churches under papal authority. The Byzantine delegation accepted terms that the Orthodox theological tradition found deeply uncomfortable, because the alternative was to return home with nothing. The union was proclaimed in the Hagia Sophia. The Byzantine people rejected it. Senior figures in the late Byzantine court made clear, in terms that later sources record, though with the usual cautions about exact wording, that they would rather see the Sultan's authority in Constantinople than submit to Roman Catholic jurisdiction. Whether those sentiments were expressed in precisely those words, or were shaped by later writers into something more quotable, the feeling they capture was real and widespread. Centuries of estrangement, culminating in the catastrophe of 1204, had made the idea of Latin authority over the Orthodox Church genuinely intolerable to the people who would have to live under it. The help the Union of Florence was supposed to unlock never arrived in sufficient quantity. A crusade was organized in 1444 AD. A Western force met the Ottomans at Varna in Bulgaria and was destroyed. It was the last serious Western military attempt to stop Ottoman expansion in southeastern Europe before Constantinople fell. The city stood alone. The last emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, came to the throne in 1449 AD, knowing with a clarity that his correspondence makes plain exactly what was coming and approximately when. He spent his reign preparing the city as well as his resources allowed, appealing for Western help with a persistence that never crossed into delusion, maintaining the dignity and the ritual of the imperial office with a conscientiousness that his circumstances made genuinely moving. He never married after his second wife died, though his advisors pressed him to produce an heir. There was no point in an heir. There was no empire to inherit. He governed what remained, with care and without self-pity. The light in the city was very low by now, but it had not gone out. Not yet. Chapter 11. The Ottoman Shadow. The man who would end the Byzantine Empire was born in 1432 AD. Mehmed II, son of the Ottoman Sultan Murad II, came into the world in Edirne, the former Byzantine city of Adrianople that had served as the Ottoman capital since its capture. His childhood was not easy. He was not initially the favoured heir. His first attempt at governance as a young adolescent was not successful enough to impress his father. When Murad died in 1451 AD and Mehmed came to the throne, he was 19 years old. He had been thinking about Constantinople since childhood. The city occupied a specific place in Ottoman and Islamic consciousness that went beyond military strategy. Traditions preserved in Islamic scholarship attributed to the Prophet Muhammad words about the eventual conquest of Constantinople that had been part of Islamic memory since the early centuries of the faith. To take Constantinople was not merely to expand Ottoman territory. It was to fulfill something long anticipated. Mehmed also understood the strategic reality with a precision that his predecessors had lacked the technology to act upon. Constantinople could not be taken by the methods that had been tried before. The Theodosian walls remained intact and formidable, despite the decades of Ottoman encirclement. The city could still be supplied by sea as long as its defenders controlled the Bosphorus. No army without naval superiority and without the ability to breach the land walls could take the city. Mehmed addressed both problems. He began construction of a fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus in 1452 AD, directly across from an existing Ottoman fortress on the Asian shore, creating a choke point that gave Ottoman artillery control of the strait and effectively ended Constantinople's ability to receive supplies from the Black Sea. He built it in 4 months. Then he found his cannons. A Hungarian engineer named Urban had previously offered his services and his expertise in casting large bronze artillery to Constantine XI. The Byzantine emperor could not afford to pay him adequately. Urban went to Mehmed instead. What Urban cast for the Ottoman Sultan was, by the standards of the mid-15th century, unlike anything previously built for siege warfare. The great cannon required hundreds of oxen and thousands of men to move. It could fire only a limited number of times per day because the barrel required cooling between shots. But each shot, when it struck the Theodosian walls, did damage that no previous weapon had been able to inflict. The walls had been designed and built in a world without gunpowder, artillery. Their thickness and height, which had made them impregnable to everything earlier centuries could bring against them, were simply not the properties that mattered against a weapon that shattered stonework with kinetic energy that no human force could match. Mehmed assembled his forces in the spring of 1453 AD. Estimates of the size of the Ottoman force vary considerably across ancient sources and modern scholarship, and the question of exact numbers has occupied historians for centuries. What the sources broadly agree on is that Mehmed commanded a substantially larger force than the city's defenders, supported by a fleet of over 100 ships. Against this, Constantine XI had estimates in various sources ranging from around 5,000 to 7,000 defenders, including Western volunteers, Genoese and Venetian soldiers whose presence reflected both genuine sympathy and the commercial interests their cities still maintained in Constantinople. The siege began on the 6th of April in 1453 AD. The great cannon began its work against the Theodosian walls almost immediately. Sections of wall that had stood since the 5th century were breached or weakened by the daily bombardment. Byzantine repair crews worked through the nights, filling gaps with earth and timber barricades, improvised repairs that absorbed subsequent shots differently than the original stone, but that could not replace the structural integrity that had been lost. The pattern established itself quickly. Ottoman artillery would damage a section of wall during the day. Byzantine defenders would repair it during the night. Ottoman infantry assaults would be repulsed by defenders who fought with a desperation that the numerical disparity made absolute. Constantine moved constantly along the walls during the siege, personally present at the points of greatest danger. His presence, both practical and symbolic, was necessary to maintain the morale of a garrison that understood with increasing clarity what the arithmetic of the situation meant. The sea approach presented a separate problem. A great chain had been stretched across the mouth of the Golden Horn, as in previous sieges, preventing the Ottoman fleet from entering the harbour and attacking the sea walls on the city's northern side. The Byzantine and Genoese ships holding the chain were outperforming their Ottoman counterparts in direct naval engagements. Mehmed solved this with a solution so audacious that contemporaries on both sides recorded it with astonishment. He had his ships carried overland. A road of greased logs was laid across the ridge of the Galata Hill on the northern side of the Golden Horn. Ottoman ships were hauled out of the Bosphorus, dragged up the hill, and launched into the Golden Horn on the other side, behind the chain. In a single night, approximately 70 Ottoman ships appeared in the Golden Horn. The harbour that had been sealed was now full of enemy vessels. The sea walls that had been virtually undefended because the chain was supposed to make them safe suddenly required garrison forces that the already stretched defence could not provide without weakening the land walls. Inside the city, the garrison understood what this meant. There was no sector of the walls that could be safely ignored now. Every man they had was already committed, and the enemy had just opened a new front. The weeks that followed were grinding and increasingly desperate. A relief fleet expected from Venice did not arrive in time. The Western help that the Union of Florence had been supposed to guarantee had not materialized in sufficient quantities. Inside the city, the theological controversy over the Union continued even as Ottoman cannons worked at the walls daily. Constantine navigated these internal tensions with a patience that the circumstances made remarkable. On the 22nd of May, in 1453 AD, a lunar eclipse darkened the moon over Constantinople. Byzantine tradition held that the city would never fall while the moon was full. The eclipse felt to a population already stretched to its limit. Like a sign, then a strange light was reported, playing around the dome of the Hagia Sophia. Contemporary sources on both sides describe something unusual seen in the sky above the church that night. The Byzantine interpretation was that the Holy Spirit was departing the city. The Ottoman interpretation was that divine light was indicating the city's imminent fall to Islam. The same phenomenon, read through the lens of each tradition, pointed in the same direction. The final assault came in the early hours of the 29th of May in 1453 AD. Mehmed had been preparing it for days. He addressed his forces before the assault, and accounts preserved in the Ottoman tradition describe him, speaking of both the religious significance of what they were about to do and the practical rewards of conquest that awaited those who survived. The attack began around 1:30 in the morning. The first waves were the irregular troops, whose losses were acceptable because they were not the elite of the Ottoman army. They came against the walls in the darkness with ladders and with fury, and they were repulsed. But the cost of repulsing them was paid by the same garrison that had been fighting and repairing and fighting again for 53 days. Then the Anatolian regulars came. Then the Janissaries, the elite corps of the Ottoman army, held back for this moment. The wall held, the defenders held, and then a small gate was found open. The Kerko Porta, a postern gate in the Blackenay section of the walls in the northwestern corner of the city, had been left unlocked, whether through negligence, betrayal, or the simple chaos of a long siege in which a garrison of several thousand was defending kilometers of wall. Accounts disagree, and the question has never been definitively resolved. Ottoman soldiers found it and poured through. At approximately the same moment, Giovanni Justiniani, the Genoese commander who had been one of the most effective defenders throughout the siege, was severely wounded. He was carried from the wall. His removal from his critical position on the most vulnerable section of the defences created a gap in the command structure at the worst possible moment. The Janissaries found the breach and exploited it. Within minutes, the Ottoman flag was flying from a tower above the walls. Constantine XI saw it. Byzantine sources record that he removed his imperial insignia, the symbols of rank that would have identified him as the emperor and made him a prisoner worth taking alive. He charged into the fighting with the soldiers around him. He was never seen again. His body was never identified with certainty. Constantine XI, the last Roman emperor, died somewhere in the breach of the walls of the city that his namesake had built 1123 years before. Sit with that for a moment. 1123 years. From the man who first put spear to earth on that peninsula above the Bosphorus, to the man who died defending what that gesture had built. The same city, the same walls, repaired and rebuilt across the centuries. The same name, carried from the first emperor to the last, as if history had planned it that way. The city fell on the morning of the 29th of May. Mehmed waited outside the walls until the fighting was largely over, then rode in on horseback. He went to the Hagia Sophia. He stood in the nave and looked up at the dome, at the light falling through the 40 windows at its base and diffusing through the interior in the way it had done for 916 years. He ordered it converted to a mosque. He pressed his face to the floor in prayer. He took, from that day forward, a new title, Kayseri Rum, Caesar of Rome, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, 21 years old, standing in the greatest building of the civilization he had just ended, calling himself by the title that Augustus had made the symbol of supreme power in the Western world, was making a specific and deliberate claim. He was not simply a conqueror, he was an heir. The Roman tradition did not die with the last Palaiologos emperor in the breach of the Theodosian walls. It was claimed, absorbed, carried forward in a different form, under a different faith, by a different civilization. The Hagia Sophia still stood. The dome was intact. The light still fell through the 40 windows and moved across the marble floor. It was a mosque now. The city that Constantine had called Nova Roma, that the world had called Constantinople for 11 centuries, would be called Istanbul. The last Roman emperor was dead, and in the libraries of the city, and in the ships that had been leaving Constantinople for years, as the Ottoman shadow lengthened, and in the hands and memories of scholars who had understood that the end was coming and had taken precautions. Something was moving westward, the manuscripts, the learning, the preserved inheritance of 2,000 years of Greek and Roman civilization, moving toward Florence, moving toward the fire that would become the Renaissance. The story was not over. It was changing shape. Chapter 12. What Byzantium left behind. There is a kind of survival that history does not always see clearly. Not the survival of walls, or armies, or dynasties. Something quieter than those. The survival of ideas. The survival of texts. The survival of ways of thinking about the world that outlast everything built to protect them. It happens not in the dramatic moment of a last stand, but in the quiet determination of a scholar copying a manuscript by lamplight, in the careful packing of books into chests before a city falls, in the decision to carry something fragile and irreplaceable across a dangerous sea to somewhere it might be safe. This kind of survival is harder to see than the fall of walls. It tends to matter more. Picture Bessarion. He was a Byzantine scholar and theologian, born in Trebizond around 1403 AD, educated in Constantinople, sent to the Council of Florence in 1439 AD as part of the Byzantine delegation negotiating the union of the churches. He was a man of genuine intellectual distinction, one of the most learned Greek scholars of his generation, and he understood, with a clarity that some of his contemporaries found uncomfortable, exactly what was at stake in those negotiations. Not just the theology, not just the politics, the books. He converted to Roman Catholicism and was made a cardinal. His fellow Byzantines, who had remained orthodox, considered this a betrayal. He considered it a calculation. He was choosing the side that might, in the long run, to be able to protect what he spent the rest of his life trying to save. He began collecting Greek manuscripts, systematically, patiently, over decades, using his position in the Roman Catholic hierarchy to acquire texts, fund copying projects, track down volumes that had been scattered across the Italian peninsula in the hands of collectors who did not always understand what they possessed. He donated his entire collection to Venice in 1468 AD. It became the foundation of the Bibliotheca Marciana, the great library of Venice that still holds one of the most important collections of Greek manuscripts in the world. You can visit it today. The manuscripts are still there, in a building directly across the piazza from St. Mark's Basilica, a few hundred meters from the bronze horses taken from the Byzantine hippodrome 6 centuries before. The proximity is not accidental. Venice took things from Byzantium. Venice also, through men like Bessarion, received things that Byzantium chose to give. Bessarion was not alone in this work. He was part of a broader movement of Byzantine scholars, some famous and some now forgotten, who understood that the physical empire was dying, and that what had to be saved was not the buildings or the territory or the political institutions, but the knowledge. Among them was Gemistos Plethon, one of the most remarkable intellectuals of the late Byzantine world, who travelled to Florence with the council delegation and delivered lectures on Platonic philosophy that made a deep impression on the Florentine intellectual community. Cosimo de' Medici attended those lectures. He later founded the Platonic Academy of Florence, an institution dedicated to the study and translation of Greek philosophy. The Academy became one of the central intellectual institutions of what we now call the Renaissance. It is fair to say, as historians of the period widely do, that Byzantine scholarship played a significant role in shaping the particular character of Renaissance humanism. Its intense engagement with Platonic philosophy, its recovery of Greek as a language of serious intellectual work, its access to the full range of classical literature, how much weight to place on this contribution relative to other factors, the indigenous Italian intellectual traditions, the economic conditions of the Italian city-states, remains a question historians continue to discuss. The Byzantine contribution was real and substantial. It was among the most important sources, though not the only one. Think for a moment about what the Byzantine manuscript tradition actually preserved. The works of Plato, the complete corpus of Greek tragedy and comedy, as much as had survived the centuries of copying and loss, the histories of Thucydides and Herodotus, the mathematical works of Euclid and Archimedes, the medical writings of Galen. These had survived in the Byzantine tradition because Byzantine scholars recognized their value and kept copying them, century after patient century. In the libraries and monasteries of the Eastern Empire, Western Europe in the medieval period had known a fraction of this inheritance. The recovery of the full corpus, transmitted through Byzantine hands, helped transform the intellectual landscape of 15th and 16th century Europe. The world that produced Leonardo and Galileo and Erasmus was built, in part, on foundations that Byzantine scholars had spent centuries preserving. The legal inheritance ran alongside the cultural one. Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis had been rediscovered in Western Europe in the late 11th century and had transformed legal education across the continent. The University of Bologna, founded around 1088 AD, was built largely around the study of Roman law as compiled by Justinian's scholars. From Bologna, systematic legal education spread across Europe. The civil law tradition that governs most of continental Europe, Latin America, and large parts of the wider world today traces its foundations. Through many centuries of development and adaptation, back to the work that Tribonian's team assembled in 6th century Constantinople. When Napoleon's lawyers designed the code that still underlies French law today, the framework they were working within had been shaped by Justinian's compilation, studied and taught in European universities for 7 centuries. The Orthodox Christian tradition was itself one of the most enduring elements of the Byzantine legacy. The missionary work of the Macedonian period had carried Eastern Orthodox Christianity northward into the Slavic world. The Christianization of the Rus, the conversion of Bulgaria and Serbia, the spread of the Cyrillic alphabet. All of these were achievements of Byzantine civilization whose consequences extended far beyond the empire's political borders and far beyond its political lifespan. After 1453, Russia came to understand itself as an important heir and protector of Orthodox Christianity. The concept of Moscow as a continuation of the Roman imperial tradition, succeeding Constantinople as the center of Orthodox Christendom, developed over the decades and centuries after the fall and shaped Russian political and religious identity in significant ways. The Tsar, the Russian word that is simply Caesar, pronounced through Slavic phonology, ruled as the protector of a tradition that traced back through Constantinople to Constantine himself. The imperial double-headed eagle of Byzantium became the symbol of the Russian Empire. Stand in any Russian Orthodox church today, anywhere in the world, and you are standing in a space shaped by decisions made in Constantinople across 11 centuries of Byzantine religious and artistic development. The liturgy being chanted is a descendant of the liturgy chanted in the Hagia Sophia. The icons on the walls are part of a tradition that Byzantine artists and theologians developed together across 1,000 years. The Byzantine tradition lives in those communities with a continuity that is not metaphorical. It is institutional, liturgical, carried forward in the same words and the same gestures across 16 centuries of unbroken practice. The art alone would justify the historical attention that Byzantium sometimes struggles to receive. Byzantine icons represent one of the most refined traditions of sacred visual art produced by any civilization. The tradition was not a primitive predecessor to Western Renaissance painting. It was a different solution to a different problem. Western Renaissance art sought to represent the natural world with increasing fidelity, to paint the human body as it appears to the physical eye. Byzantine icon painting sought to represent the divine reality behind physical appearance, to paint what the soul perceives rather than what the eye sees. El Greco, born Dominikos Theotokopoulos on the Byzantine island of Crete in 1541 AD, trained first as a Byzantine icon painter before travelling to Venice and then to Spain. His elongated figures and intense spirituality are sometimes described purely in terms of Western Mannerist influence. They are also the inheritance of a tradition that had been thinking about how to paint the sacred for 1,000 years before he picked up a brush. Two traditions. One artist. The seam barely visible. The architecture of Byzantine civilization reached further than its political borders. When Ottoman architects designed the great imperial mosques of Istanbul in the 16th century, they were working in conscious engagement with the building that Anthemius and Isidore had raised for Justinian 9 centuries earlier. The cascading dome system of the great Ottoman mosques, the flooding of the interior with diffuse light, the sense of a vast interior space that seems larger than its physical dimensions can account for. All of these reflect Byzantine structural innovations that Ottoman architects studied, absorbed, and made their own. The building that Mehmed converted to a mosque continued, through its influence on the architects who worked with it and around it, to shape the buildings of the civilization that had conquered it. Rome, in this sense, never stopped building. Consider for a moment the full scope of what the Byzantine inheritance means. The legal systems of most of the world's nations trace intellectual lineages that run through Byzantine preservation of Roman law. The religious traditions of hundreds of millions of Orthodox Christians across Russia, Greece, Eastern Europe, and the global diaspora are the direct institutional descendants of Byzantine Christianity. The manuscript tradition that preserved classical learning helped make the Renaissance possible, and the Renaissance helped make the modern intellectual world. The architectural forms that run from the Hagia Sophia through the great Ottoman mosques to the domed public buildings of the 19th and 20th centuries all carry the structural logic that Byzantine builders first worked out at scale, and through all of this, something harder to quantify, but perhaps as important as any of it, the idea that civilization is worth defending, not as an abstraction, as a practical commitment. A commitment that requires real people to stand at real walls on real mornings, when the army outside is larger than the army inside, and the arithmetic is not encouraging. A commitment that requires old men to pack manuscripts into chests and carry them across dangerous seas to places where they might survive. The men and women who defended Constantinople across 11 centuries, who repaired the walls after each earthquake, who deployed Greek fire against Arab fleets in the darkness of the Bosphorus, who stood at those walls in 717 AD, with the largest force the caliphate had assembled, pointed directly at them, who kept the libraries and copied the manuscripts and argued the theology with a passion that seems excessive until you understand what the arguments were actually about. Those people were defending something they understood to be worth the cost. They were not always right about every decision they made in that defense. The treachery at Manzikert and the civil wars that followed. The catastrophe of 1204. The theological controversies that divided the Church at moments when unity was essential. All of these were failures of the civilization to live up to its own best understanding of itself. But the commitment itself, the conviction that civilization is not an accident of history, but an achievement that requires continuous effort to maintain, is one of the most important things the Byzantine tradition passed on to the cultures that inherited it. It is still being passed on in the legal codes of nations that have never heard of Justinian, in the liturgies of churches that trace their practice back through an unbroken chain to the patriarchs of Constantinople, in the manuscripts that Bessarion packed into chests and shipped to Venice and that still sit in the Bibliotheca Marciana, pages turned by scholars who understand something of what it cost to keep them safe, in the dome of the Hagia Sophia, still standing above Istanbul after 15 centuries, still catching the morning light through the 40 windows at its base and scattering it across the floor in a way that no one who walks into that building can quite explain or quite forget. The Byzantine Empire is gone. What it built is not. And so the story comes to its close. 11 centuries. From Constantine putting spear to earth on a peninsula between two seas, to the last emperor dying in the breach of the walls his predecessor had built. From a handful of workers mixing mortar in 324 AD, to the cannons that finally broke what those walls had held for 1,000 years. It is a long story, the longest, perhaps, in the history of the Western world. What stays with me, after all of it, is not the battles or the emperors or the monuments, though the monuments are extraordinary. It is Bessarion, old man in a cardinal's robes, in a room in Venice, surrounded by manuscripts, knowing that the city he grew up in is gone, that the streets he walked as a child, the libraries he studied in as a young man, the dome he watched catch the morning light, all of it is gone, and writing another letter to another potential donor, cataloguing another text, making sure another manuscript is copied before the original crumbles. Not a general, not a soldier, not a man whose name appears in the chronicles of battles, just a man who understood what was worth saving and spent his life saving it. He did not save everything. No one could have. What was lost in 1204 and what was lost in 1453 can never be fully accounted for. The libraries that burned, the manuscripts that were used as kindling, the artworks melted for their metal, the knowledge that simply ceased to exist because the person who held it died and no one wrote it down. All of that is gone. But what Bessarion saved, what the other Byzantine scholars saved, what the monks and scribes and librarians of Constantinople saved across 11 centuries of continuous, patient, unglamorous effort that is still here, in the universities that trace their legal education back to Bologna and through Bologna back to Justinian, in the Orthodox churches whose liturgy has been continuous since the patriarchs of Byzantium first shaped it, in the philosophical tradition that runs from Plato through the Byzantine Academy to the Florentine Platonists to the modern world, in the dome of the Hagia Sophia that still, after 15 centuries, does something with light that architects continue to study. Rome did not end in 476 AD. It did not end in 1453. It changed shape, again and again, across 15 centuries of change and loss and survival and transmission. It changed shape, but it did not end. The dome still stands. The light still falls through the 40 windows. The manuscripts are still in Venice. The story is still being read. Sleep well,